Nobody expected Deion Sanders to stay quiet forever, but when he finally spoke, it wasn't the usual confidence or flashy sound bites people associate with Coach Prime. This time, it was different. This time, it felt personal. And if you were paying close attention, it sounded like someone who had watched a line get crossed far too many times. Because this wasn't just about wins and losses. It wasn't about box scores or highlight clips. According to Deion, what his son Shedeur Sanders dealt with this season went far beyond normal rookie struggles. Behind closed doors, things weren't as clean or fair as they were being presented to the public. And the people pushing the loudest narratives weren't always the ones watching the tape. Shedeur didn't come into the league asking for special treatment. He didn't demand a starting job. He didn't hide from pressure. Instead, he was thrown into chaotic situations, brutal conditions, limited preparation, and constant scrutiny, all while being judged harsher than players in the exact same position. And somehow, every mistake became proof that he didn't belong. What made this moment explode wasn't just Deion finally saying what he'd been holding back. It was who backed him up next. Because when one of the most respected evaluators in football flat out accused parts of the media of lying about Shedeur Sanders, the conversation shifted instantly. This stopped being opinion. It became an accountability problem. And once you really look at what's been happening, a much bigger question starts to form. Was Shedeur Sanders ever evaluated fairly? Or was the verdict decided long before he ever got a real chance to prove himself? Because what happened next exposed way more than just one quarterback. The truth is, Shedeur Sanders didn't enter the NFL with a clean slate. Long before he took a meaningful snap, a version of his story had already been written for him. And once that kind of narrative settles in, it becomes almost impossible to escape. From the moment his name entered draft conversations, the focus shifted away from what he actually put on tape. Instead of breakdowns and nuance, the discussion turned into assumptions. Too confident, too flashy, too much baggage. Suddenly, every evaluation came with an asterisk that had nothing to do with football. Being Deion Sanders' son wasn't just context anymore. It became a filter through which everything he did was judged. The draft slide only made it worse. Rather than asking why teams passed or what circumstances influenced those decisions, parts of the media treated the fall as confirmation, as if the league had already spoken and the case was closed. Never mind that quarterbacks slide every year for reasons that have nothing to do with talent. Never mind that opportunity, scheme, and timing play massive roles. With Shedeur, the explanation was kept simple and lazy. If he was really that good, he wouldn't have fallen. End of discussion. That mindset followed him straight into the building. Practices weren't viewed as chances to grow. They were auditions. Every rep felt like a test he could fail but never fully pass. If he looked sharp, it was dismissed as expected. If he struggled, it was amplified as proof. That's how pre-written narratives work. Positives get minimized, negatives get magnified. And the most dangerous part, once a player gets boxed into that kind of storyline, context disappears. There's no patience curve. There's no room for adjustment. Rookie mistakes aren't treated like steps in development. They're treated like red flags. Other young quarterbacks get grace periods. Shedeur got microscopes. What made it even more frustrating was how quietly it happened. There was no official declaration. No headline saying he wouldn't get a fair shot. It showed up in tone, in framing, in the way questions were asked and answers were ignored. The skepticism didn't grow over time, it arrived fully formed. And that set the stage for everything that followed. Because once the league and the media start evaluating a quarterback based on who they think he is instead of what he's actually doing, the game stops being about performance. And from that point on, every single mistake was destined to mean more than it should have. Once that narrative took hold, mistakes stopped being part of development and started being used as evidence. And in the NFL, that's one of the most dangerous places a young quarterback can be. Every interception Shedeur Sanders threw came with a level of outrage that felt disproportionate. It wasn't framed as a rookie learning timing or adjusting to disguised coverages. It wasn't broken down with context or nuance. Instead, it was treated like a character flaw. One bad read suddenly meant he wasn't ready. One tipped ball became proof that he couldn't process at NFL speed. The conversation skipped steps and jumped straight to conclusions. What made it even more glaring was how differently similar mistakes were handled elsewhere. Around the league, quarterbacks with far more experience were throwing interceptions off batted passes, miscommunications, and pressure breakdowns. And when that happened, the language softened immediately. Analysts talked about protection issues. They mentioned receivers drifting on routes. They discussed scheme mismatches and timing problems. Football became complex again. But with Shedeur, that complexity vanished. There was no pause to explain what went wrong, no effort to rewind the play and look at the full picture. The takeaway was always the same: turnover equals failure. And that's not evaluation, that's branding. The problem with that approach is simple. Quarterback is the most mistake-prone position in professional sports, especially early on. Growth is messy. Progress isn't linear. Even the league's best players have entire seasons where interceptions pile up. That's part of the process, or at least it's supposed to be. For Shedeur, mistakes didn't just hurt his stat line. They fueled a cycle. Negative coverage led to tighter scrutiny. Tighter scrutiny led to shorter leashes. Shorter leashes created pressure, and pressure makes mistakes more likely. Once you're in that loop, it becomes less about performance and more about survival. And that pressure didn't stay on the field. It showed up in how every rep was discussed publicly. A clean drive wouldn't move the needle. A single bad throw would dominate the conversation. That imbalance matters because confidence matters. Rhythm matters. Young quarterbacks don't thrive when they feel like one mistake can erase everything they've done right. This wasn't accountability. Accountability applies standards evenly. What Shedeur faced was selective punishment. And the more it happened, the clearer it became that these mistakes weren't just being noticed. They were being used. And that's when Deion Sanders stopped seeing this as normal growing pains and started seeing something else entirely. Deion Sanders didn't step in because he wanted attention. He stepped in because, from his perspective, the situation had crossed from criticism into something far more troubling. What he was watching wasn't tough love or accountability. It was a slow buildup of pressure that felt intentional, persistent, and unfair. For months, Deion stayed measured. He let the process play out. He trusted that work ethic, preparation, and performance would eventually speak louder than noise. But the longer the season went on, the clearer it became that the noise wasn't fading. It was getting louder. And worse, it was shaping reality for people who weren't actually watching closely. When Deion finally spoke, he didn't attack stats. He didn't argue box scores. He talked about context, about how Shedeur was thrown into situations most young quarterbacks never experience. Limited prep, inconsistent reps, brutal conditions, no steady runway. And yet, every outcome was being judged as if the playing field was level. That's what made his comments hit differently. This wasn't a father defending his son blindly. This was someone calling out a system that claims to value development while quietly denying it. Deion made it clear that Shedeur wasn't just competing against defenses on Sundays. He was fighting internal hesitation, external skepticism, and a media narrative that never reset. And the part that frustrated him the most wasn't the criticism itself. It was the inconsistency. Watching similar mistakes get explained away for other quarterbacks while Shedeur's were treated as unforgivable. Seeing effort and resilience ignored because they didn't fit the storyline already in place. That's when silence stopped being an option. What Deion understood, and what many fans started to notice too, is that young quarterbacks don't fail in isolation. Environments matter. Support matters. Confidence is built through trust, not suspicion. And when a player feels like every rep is under surveillance instead of instruction, growth slows down fast. By speaking up, Deion forced people to confront something uncomfortable. Not whether Shedeur was perfect, but whether he was being evaluated honestly. And once that question was out in the open, it couldn't be brushed aside as emotional noise. Because suddenly, others started saying what Deion had been hinting at all along. Former players, analysts, people with nothing to gain from defending Shedeur Sanders. The idea that this was just a protective father ranting didn't hold up anymore. And then came the moment that truly changed the tone of the entire conversation. Because the next voice to step in wasn't emotional, it wasn't personal, it was one of the most respected evaluators the sport has ever had. Up until this point, it was easy for critics to dismiss the conversation as emotional. A protective father, a frustrated camp, noise surrounding a high-profile name. But that narrative collapsed the moment Mel Kiper Jr. stepped into the discussion. Mel Kiper isn't known for chasing controversy. His entire reputation is built on film, patterns, and consistency. Decades of draft analysis have made him one of the most trusted evaluators in football, not because he's always right, but because he's always thorough. So when he looked at the coverage surrounding Shedeur Sanders and said, plainly, that parts of the media were lying about how he played this season, the tone shifted instantly. That wasn't a hot take, that was an indictment. Kiper didn't argue that Shedeur was flawless. He didn't deny interceptions or rough moments. Instead, he pointed out something far more uncomfortable. The way those moments were being framed didn't match the tape. Context was being stripped away. Film was being ignored. And a conclusion was being pushed that didn't line up with reality. That matters because Mel Kiper has no incentive to protect Shedeur Sanders. There's no personal connection, no branding angle, no reason to step into backlash unless the evidence forces your hand. And according to Kiper, the evidence did exactly that. What he exposed was a credibility problem. If mistakes were being exaggerated and progress was being dismissed, then the issue wasn't performance, it was perception. The story being sold had already decided the outcome, and the film was being bent to fit it. Once that door opened, everything underneath it became visible. Moving goalposts, uneven standards, selective patience, quarterbacks in similar situations being judged with nuance while Shedeur was judged with absolutes. Kiper didn't need to raise his voice to make the point land. The comparison spoke for itself. And the most damning part, none of the critics could meaningfully challenge what he said. Because to do that, they would have had to go back to the tape and explain why Shedeur was being held to a different standard. They would have had to admit that development isn't linear and that rookies struggle by design. Instead, silence followed, and silence in this case was loud. Because when someone with Kiper's credibility calls out misrepresentation, it forces a reckoning. The conversation was no longer about whether Shedeur Sanders deserved patience. It became about why he wasn't getting it. And that set up a comparison that nobody seemed ready to answer. One that exposed just how uneven the playing field really was. Once Mel Kiper said what he said, the comparisons became unavoidable. Because if the tape mattered and context mattered, then the next question was obvious. Why were the rules suddenly different for Shedeur Sanders? Around the league, veteran quarterbacks throw interceptions every single week. Some of them are clean mistakes, some are tipped balls, some are forced throws under pressure. And when that happens, the conversation immediately expands. Analysts talk about protection breaking down. They talk about receivers drifting. They talk about timing issues, scheme mismatches, or defensive disguises. Football becomes layered and complex again. But when Shedeur made the same kinds of mistakes, all of that disappeared. There was no pause, no rewind, no breakdown. The takeaway was instant and absolute. He's not ready. He can't process fast enough. He's overwhelmed. That gap in treatment wasn't subtle, it was glaring. The most revealing comparison involved quarterbacks who were already established. Players who had years of first-team reps, full training camps, and organizational trust behind them. When they struggled, the benefit of the doubt arrived automatically. Development wasn't questioned. Their identity wasn't rewritten. Their future wasn't suddenly up for debate. Shedeur didn't get that grace. Despite being a rookie, despite limited preparation, despite inconsistent opportunities, he was judged as if he were already supposed to be the finished product. And that's not how quarterback development works. Not now, not ever. What made the double standard so frustrating was how confidently it was presented. The language used around Shedeur was final, defining, heavy, while the language used for others was flexible and forgiving. One group was allowed context, the other was denied it. And once you see that difference, you can't unsee it, because it forces you to ask whether the evaluation was ever about performance at all, or whether the conclusion had been decided long before the evidence was reviewed. This is where credibility starts to crack, because football analysis only works when standards are applied evenly, when mistakes are weighed the same regardless of name, draft slot, or background, when development is understood as a process, not a verdict. Instead, Shedeur became the exception, the quarterback who had to be perfect to be considered playable, the one who couldn't afford normal rookie errors. And that kind of pressure doesn't create growth, it creates hesitation. And as that hesitation built, the criticism didn't slow down. It expanded, moving beyond turnovers and into something even harder to quantify, but just as damaging. The conversation around who Shedeur Sanders was as a leader and whether he belonged at all. At some point, the criticism shifted away from football entirely. It stopped being about reads, mechanics, or turnovers and turned into something far more subjective: leadership, confidence, personality. And that's where the Sanders stigma quietly took over. Shedeur Sanders' confidence has always been visible. He speaks calmly. He carries himself with certainty. He doesn't shrink when things go wrong. For most quarterbacks, those traits are celebrated. They're called leadership, poise, command. But with Shedeur, the language changed. Confidence became arrogance. Composure became entitlement. Self-belief became a problem that needed fixing. What made that framing so strange was how little it lined up with reality inside the locker room. Teammates consistently spoke about his preparation. Coaches acknowledged his understanding of the playbook. Players trusted his presence in the huddle. None of that matched the public narrative being pushed. And that's where the last name mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Being a Sanders comes with visibility, but it also comes with baggage. Deion Sanders built his career by being unapologetically himself, and that brand still makes people uncomfortable. So when Shedeur shows confidence, it doesn't get evaluated on its own. It gets compared. It gets projected onto. People don't just see Shedeur, they see prime time, and then they react to that image instead of the player in front of them. This is how bias works at a subtle level. Nobody comes out and says it directly. It shows up in tone, in assumptions, in how quickly doubts surface. Shedeur doesn't get the benefit of being young and learning. He gets framed as someone who needs to be humbled, and that framing is dangerous because it has nothing to do with football development. Leadership isn't about being quiet. It's about command, resilience, and consistency. And Shedeur showed those traits repeatedly, even while operating in unstable circumstances. He didn't fold. He didn't point fingers. He didn't make excuses. He kept working. But those qualities rarely made headlines because they didn't fit the narrative already in place. Instead, the focus stayed on how he was perceived, not how he performed. And once a player's personality becomes the story, it becomes easy to justify anything that happens next. Fewer reps, shorter patience, louder criticism. By this point, it was clear that Shedeur Sanders wasn't just being evaluated as a quarterback. He was being evaluated as an idea, and ideas are much harder to change than stats. And when that happens, logic starts to fade completely, because the criticism no longer needs evidence, it just needs reinforcement. By the time the conversation reached this point, logic had quietly exited the room. The criticism surrounding Shedeur Sanders wasn't just harsh anymore. It was inconsistent, contradictory, and increasingly detached from reality. One of the strangest arguments to surface was the idea that his background somehow disqualified him, that coming from a warm weather program meant he wouldn't be able to handle tougher environments, as if temperature determines decision-making, as if arm talent disappears when the air gets colder. It was the kind of take that sounds reasonable on the surface, until you think about it for more than 5 seconds. NFL history is full of quarterbacks who came from warm climates and thrived in cold weather cities. But that history suddenly didn't matter, because at this stage, facts weren't being used to inform opinions. They were being ignored to protect them. That's when confirmation bias took over completely. Every negative rep was magnified. Every positive moment was explained away. A clean throw became expected. A smart decision became nothing special. But a single mistake, that was proof. Proof that the doubts were justified. Proof that the skepticism was right all along. This is how narratives become self-sustaining. Once someone decides a player doesn't belong, everything they see reinforces that belief. The evaluation stops being curious. It becomes defensive, and anyone who challenges it gets labeled as biased or emotional. The most telling part was how little curiosity remained in the coverage. There were fewer questions being asked and more statements being made. Less, "Why did this happen?" and more, "This is who he is." That shift matters because development depends on curiosity. Analysis depends on context. And once those disappear, coverage turns into branding. Shedeur Sanders wasn't being analyzed anymore. He was being categorized. And once a player is categorized, especially early in their career, it becomes incredibly difficult to escape. Because now every decision made around him feels justified. Fewer reps make sense. Shorter patience feels earned. Lack of trust becomes reasonable. The narrative doesn't just explain outcomes, it excuses them. This is where the situation crossed from frustrating to damaging, not just for Shedeur, but for the integrity of evaluation itself. Because if logic can be suspended this easily, then no young quarterback is truly safe from it. Anyone can be miscast. Anyone can be boxed in. And that's when it became clear this wasn't just about media takes anymore. The consequences of this thinking were starting to show up where it mattered most. Behind the scenes. What made this situation even more damaging was what was happening behind the scenes. Because development doesn't fail loudly. It fails quietly, through missed opportunities, inconsistent reps, and a lack of trust that never shows up in the box score. Young quarterbacks don't grow by watching. They grow through repetition. Rhythm and being allowed to make mistakes without fearing immediate consequences. That runway matters. And for Shedeur Sanders, that runway never really existed. Instead of a clear developmental plan, there was uncertainty. Instead of continuity, there were constant shifts. Instead of confidence being built, doubt crept in. When reps are limited, every snap carries extra weight. When opportunities are inconsistent, hesitation sets in. And when a quarterback feels like one mistake could cost him everything, it changes how he plays. That's not weakness. That's human nature, especially at the most demanding position in professional sports. What made it worse was the contrast. Other young quarterbacks around the league were allowed to struggle publicly while learning privately. They were protected, supported, and given time to settle into the speed of the game. Shedeur didn't get that luxury. His development was treated like a debate instead of a process. And once confidence and rhythm are disrupted, progress slows. Not because the talent isn't there, but because the environment isn't built for growth. That's the part that never shows up in highlight reels or hot takes, but it matters more than almost anything else. By this point, it was clear the biggest obstacle in Shedeur Sanders' path wasn't ability, it was instability. And the consequences of that were impossible to ignore. At this point, the conversation around Shedeur Sanders can't be brushed off as noise or growing pains. What's happened reveals something much bigger than one quarterback, one season, or one team. It exposes how easily narratives can overpower facts, and how quickly evaluation turns into judgment when bias enters the room. This was never about pretending Shedeur was perfect. He was. He made mistakes. He missed reads. He threw interceptions. That's normal. That's football. That's especially normal for a young quarterback trying to find his footing in one of the most demanding environments in sports. The problem isn't that he was criticized. The problem is how that criticism was applied. Shedeur was scrutinized harder, forgiven less, and contextualized less than others in the same position. He was judged as if development wasn't allowed, as if patience was optional, as if every mistake confirmed something people had already decided to believe. And once that happens, performance stops mattering as much as perception. That's why Deion Sanders speaking up mattered. Not because he's a famous father, but because he forced honesty into a space that had grown comfortable with selective analysis. And that's why Mel Kiper Jr. stepping in mattered even more. Because when someone with that level of credibility calls out misrepresentation, it's no longer emotional, it's structural. What makes this situation uncomfortable is that it forces a mirror on football coverage itself. If narratives can be locked in this early, if standards can shift this easily, then evaluation loses credibility. It stops being about curiosity and starts being about confirmation. And once that line is crossed, players don't just get criticized, they get boxed in. Shedeur Sanders' biggest challenge has never been talent, toughness, or preparation. It's been fighting a storyline that refuses to reset no matter what the tape shows. And that kind of resistance doesn't just hurt him, it hurts the integrity of how the game is discussed. So the real question isn't whether Shedeur Sanders can succeed. It's whether he's been given a fair chance to show who he actually is. Whether the standards applied to him are the same ones applied to everyone else. And whether football discourse is willing to correct itself when it gets something wrong. Because if fairness only applies selectively, then the problem isn't the player. It's the system judging him. Drop your thoughts below, and keep watching closely because this story isn't finished yet.